بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So in today's lesson we're going to continue with our discussion of the passage to do with Al-Qadar, Al-Qadar wal-Qadar, and the passage that we were discussing. I'll just quickly summarize the main points instead of reading the whole text again. But it starts with the statement of Al-Tahawi, وَالْخَيْرُ وَالشَّرُّ مُقَدَّرَانِ عَلَى الْعِبَادِ, that both good and evil are decreed upon the servants. This decree comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He decrees good and He decrees evil upon the servants. And so the rest of the passage makes mention of some of the issues connected to this. And so from the issues which are connected to this, issue of Al-Qadar is that he discusses the issue of ability, people having the ability to act before they perform the act and whilst they do the act. And we're going to elaborate upon this inshallah ta'ala in the course of this lesson. And likewise, he makes mention of the point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He created the actions of the servants. So He created the actions of the servants, and the servants actually earn their deeds. They earn their deeds. They make kasb of their deeds. And again, this word kasb is something that we shall speak about in a bit more detail. Likewise, he raised the issue about Allah did not burden upon the people more than what they can bear. And he mentioned a statement which we explained was incorrect, in that he said that that they are not able to do except what Allah has asked them to do. Right? So that was an issue that we spoke of before. That statement is an incorrect statement, because the servants are able to do more than what Allah has asked them. But Allah, from His mercy, He has made things easy for them and lighten the affairs for them. So it's incorrect to say that the servants can only do whatever Allah has asked from them. This is incorrect. So he made that point as well. And then he mentioned how no one has any power. There is no motion, there is no movement, no power except by way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that no one can commit a good deed or keep away from an evil deed unless it is through and by the power and the might of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And everything proceeds upon Allah's will, upon His knowledge, upon His qadar, His determination, His decree. His will overcomes every other will, and His qadar, His judgment, overcomes every other judgment. He does whatever He wishes, and He is never unjust in anything that He does. So this was the general gist of the passage, and we've discussed the passage in light of the statements of Sheikh Salih al-Fawzan, Sheikh al-Albani, Sheikh Zayd al-Madkhali. And so now we're going to go into a bit more detail into some of the issues. So I think by now we should have a good background of the basic issues that are contained within this passage. And so now with the speech of Sheikh Salih al-Sheikh, we're going to elaborate in some more detail, on top of what we've already discussed previously. So the Shaykh begins by saying that in what we've read, in these passages that we've looked at from the Creed of Al-Tahawi, there is a discussion of the topic of belief, al-Iman, in the Qadar of Allah Azza wa Jal, both the good and the evil. And so this is one of the 6 pillars of Iman that we find mentioned in the Hadith of Jibreel. And so what this pillar entails is that good and evil, al-Khair wa Shar, they are decreed upon a servant. It comes from Allah. Everything comes from Allah. All of the affairs that come to a servant, whether they are good, whether they are evil, whether they are for his benefit, whether they are for his harm, whether it is guidance, whether it is misguidance, whether it is life, death, pleasure, harm, everything, all of that is decreed by Allah Azza wa Jal. And so therefore, any good which comes to him, any good which comes to a servant, it is from Allah Azza wa Jal. He made taqdeer of that, meaning that he determined it, decided and determined it to be like that. And he made tadbir. Tadbir means that after he decreed and determined that it's going to be like this, he then made tadbir. Tadbir is that he then arranged and organized and brought about that affair at the appointed time that he decreed it to be. So taqdeer is his determination, his decision, his determination to make something to be in a particular way. So for example, it could be that a servant, some good, some wealth or some good comes to him, and it's decreed for him, for it to come to him on a particular given time, in a particular location, of a particular amount. It could be wealth, it could be sustenance, it could be whatever it could be. And so this is taqdeer. Allah has already determined and decreed that 50,000 years before he created the creation. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he makes tadbir. And so this means that that decree that was decreed for that wealth or that sustenance to come to that person, at the time that it was decreed, Allah, he makes tadbir in the sense that he brings about all of those causes, those ways, those means, and brings them at the appointed time, such that that sustenance that was written for that person will come to him at that very appointed time. Right? So any good that comes to a servant, taqdeeran wa tadbiran, it is from Allah Azza wa Jal. And likewise, whatever evil, whatever harm afflicts a servant, then it is from Allah Azza wa Jal, taqdeeran wa tadbiran. Right? So this is a general principle. This is the meaning of our faith in Al-Qadar, both its good and its evil. And likewise, we also discussed in what has preceded the various levels of Al-Qadar, in the sense that Allah, His all-encompassing knowledge, He knows everything about His decrees and what will take place. That knowledge was written down, and then He wills things to come to be. Whatever He's decreed, He wills it to come to be, and He brings it into His existence by way of His creative power. So we discussed that as well. And also we mentioned that this issue of Al-Qadar, really Al-Qadar is the Sirrullah, which means it is the secret that belongs only to Allah. It is the secret of Allah Azza wa Jal about His creation. And no one else can come upon this secret, can have knowledge of this secret, what it is. Not even an angel, not even a prophet or a messenger that has been sent. This is something that is only with Allah Azza wa Jal. He knows every single thing, and He is the one who possesses great wisdom. And so He is not asked about what He does, but the servants will be asked about what they do. Right? So Al-Qadar is basically a secret that is with Allah Azza wa Jal. And so these were some of the core issues. This is just really a summary of some of the things that we should have picked up on from the previous lessons. And this brings us to this point now, which is that the issue of Al-Qadar is from the greatest topics in the deen of Islam. In the deen of Islam. Because as we said, it is a secret from the secrets of Allah Azza wa Jal. And to fully understand it, to know its reality, and to fully understand the wisdom of Allah in what He does, in what He decrees, in what He wills, in what He chooses, to fully understand the wisdom in all of that is something that is not possible. In other words, it is not possible for us to understand the wisdom behind everything that takes place, whether that's in our lives, in our own deeds, in the things that we experience and witness every single day. Some days our iman is high, some days our iman is low. Sometimes we fall into sin, sometimes we increase in our iman. And likewise in the worldly sense, our fortunes rise and decrease, our happiness, sadness, everything that's taking place, in ourselves, our souls, our families. It's not possible, although a servant might understand some of the things, he cannot understand the wisdom behind every single thing. That is not possible. That is not possible. And for this reason, it's for this reason that anyone who starts to dispute and delve into the issues of Al-Qadar, and he does so without evidence, without daleel, without evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah, then he is exposing himself to misguidance. Meaning he's putting himself in a situation where he will fall into misguidance. And for this reason, this is why everyone who went astray on the topic of Al-Qadar, Al-Qada wal-Qadar, he did so because he began to speak about it without knowledge, without evidence, and without restricting himself to what has come in the Quran and the Sunnah only. And he tried to understand with his intellect what hasn't actually come in the Quran and the Sunnah. Right? So, for that reason, this teaches us, and the point from this is that Al-Qadar is not to be spoken about. It's not to be spoken about except with a text, and then only in accordance with what the text says. Nothing more, nothing less. Nothing more, nothing less. Why? Because Al-Qadar, this issue of Al-Qadar, as we said, is an affair of the unseen. Al-Qada wal-Qadar is an affair of the unseen. A servant is not able to dispute and delve into the affairs of the unseen without evidence. Without evidence. And without evidence, if a person speaks, he is just like a person who is stumbling in the dark. Complete darkness, no light, no nothing. And he's speaking. Right? This is the example of the person who delves into Al-Qadar without daleel, without evidence. And so we see that historically then, and of course this is why the issue of Al-Qadar is so important, because historically we see that many of those who opposed the belief of the Quran and the Sunnah, belief of Ahlul Sunnah on the issue of Al-Qadar, we see they did so because of this very one reason. They began to dispute and delve and speak without evidence and use their reason in matters in which there's no place for reason. This is why we see Imam al-Tahawi in this treatise, we see that there are 2 or 3 places in which he gives attention to this topic. At the beginning or towards the early part of the book, we already discussed the issues of Al-Qadar. Now he's come back to them again in this section and deals with specific aspects of it. And likewise, right at the very end of the treatise, he will mention some of the sects who went astray in Al-Qadar as well. So we see that there are at least a few places, and this is from the angle that he's looking at the opposers, the Qadariya, the Jabariya, the various groups amongst them, how they went astray, the issues on which they went astray. Looking at them, then he's included these sentences and he's seen it fit to discuss these issues in numerous parts of his book. For that reason, this part here is actually quite a lengthy passage. There are maybe 10, 12 sentences that he's put together. Normally in the creed, you won't see this much attention being given to the one topic. You'll see small statements on an issue and then moving to the next issue. But here we see there's a large number of statements gathered together in one place. So this shows the importance. And before the Shaykh goes on to looking at the issues which are raised in this passage, he's going to mention 5 or 6 reasons as to why there is misguidance in this topic. What are the reasons? Why did people in the past, and why do people continue to make a mistake in the topic of Al-Qadar and go astray? So we'll start with some of the reasons, inshallah ta'ala. And so the first reason is not restricting oneself to what has come in the Quran and the Sunnah, and specifically the very clear and apparent texts. Right? There are very clear and explicit texts that mention affairs to do with Al-Qadar, that everything is by way of Al-Qadar. Everything is by way of Allah's Mashi'ah. Everything is with Allah's knowledge. Right? There are certain texts where they are muhkamat. Muhkamat meaning they are very explicit texts whose meaning is not ambiguous. If you to read the meaning of the text, it is very clear and unambiguous. You cannot dispute about the meaning of that text. Right? So, a person abandons these types of texts in the Quran and the Sunnah, and he goes instead to vague, generalized texts. So he uses those texts to be the foundation, and then he leaves the clear, explicit texts. Right, so this is the first cause of misguidance in the topic of Al-Qadar. In fact, this principle is not restricted only to the topic of Al-Qadar. This is general to everything. On the topic of Allah's names and attributes. On the topic of Al-Iman, faith. When, is faith negated? When is faith not negated? To do with the Khawarij and the Murji'ah. Likewise, we find that in every topic this principle applies, that you abandon the clear-cut explicit texts which are very clear and apparent in their meaning, which should be made the asal, the foundation. You leave them, then you go to the ambiguous, vague, generalized text, and you make them the foundation. And the reason for this, of course, is that whereas you cannot twist the clear, unambiguous verses and insert a meaning that you've invented to the clear text, you can do it with the general texts. And this is the way of all of the innovators. They will go to the general texts, general statements, and they will impose upon them a meaning that they desire to impose. And so they will leave the muhkamat, the unambiguous clear text, and they will go towards the mutashabihat. Mutashabihat, the ambiguous vague text. So this is the first reason, and obviously we know that it is wajib for the servant to take the muhkam, the clear, explicit, non-ambiguous verses, and he should make them to be the foundation, and any of the verses that come, which are general, whose meaning is vague, he understands them, he takes them back to the unambiguous verses, and to make sure that he understands them in the correct way. And so for that reason, in the time of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, we see that there was an incident which is reported in the Sahihs of Muslim, Bukhari, that he came out one day and the Sahaba were disputing about Al-Qadar. They were disputing about Al-Qadar. And each one was using an ayah, was using a verse from the Quran. And so when the Messenger of Allah, when he came out, his face was as red as a pomegranate because of, he became angry and at what was being done. Why? Because they were speaking about the Quran and using ayat of the Quran to clash with each other. And so obviously he reprimanded them and put an end to this. And from this we understand that the servant, he has to submit to the clear-cut, unambiguous verses and the principles which are derived from those clear verses. Because the clear verses, they teach us certain principles, sound general principles. And then any other text that we come across, that we find, then we have to return that back to those clear principles which are found from those clear verses. And so this means that any tafsir, any explanation of these verses to do with Al-Qadar that were not known to the Sahaba, then it is falsehood. It is falsehood and it is misguidance. Right? So this is the first principle which if a person opposes, he will fall into misguidance. It is the first reason why a person falls into misguidance. And in fact, as we said, this is a general principle. Every single group, every single party, every single faction, every single individual who goes astray in the past or the present, you will find that more than likely he has fallen foul of this principle. Right? He will use ambiguous verses. Or even when it comes to the statements of the Sahaba, he will go to those statements of the Sahaba and use the generalized statements of those Sahaba rather than go to the clear-cut, explicit statements. Like, for example, we see, we see many people doing this when they want to invent principles, and even with the statements of the scholars, the contemporary scholars. Someone will go and find the generalized statements of the scholars. For example, they will go to the statements of Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen and find that he has general statements of praise for the Ikhwan or Tabligh or whatever else. And then we find that he has other clear-cut statements in which he speaks against them and warns against them, which are established from him by reliable witnesses, which are recorded. And they will do the same with Shaykh bin Baz, they will do the same with Shaykh Al-Albani. Right? So they will abandon the muhkam, clear, obviously there's a difference between the speech of Allah and the speech of the Messenger and the speech of the scholars. They're not in the same category. In the speech of Allah and the speech of the scholars, in the speech of Allah and the speech of the Messenger, there can be no contradiction. Right? It is all coherent. And so we have certain principles that allow us to understand the statements of Allah and His Messenger. But when we speak of the scholars, obviously the statements of the scholars don't have the same status and they don't have the same standing as the speech of Allah and His Messenger. But nevertheless, a similar principle applies in that sometimes someone can go to a general, vague, ambiguous statement of a scholar and run with it and leave and abandon the very clear-cut, explicit statements of the same scholars. And so, as I said, there are examples that we gave to do with that, to do with the jama'at. And so one of the very clear examples from Shaykh Al-Albani, rahimahullah ta'ala, is that they will take many of his statements to do with boycotting, for example, and that speak about boycotting, and then they will leave the very clear-cut statements in which he says that boycotting is a necessity after the other avenues have been traversed. So meaning, it's a last resort. Not that it should never ever be used, but it is a last resort. So the point being that if you take this approach, whether to the statements of Allah and the Messenger ﷺ, or the Sahaba, or the Imams of the Salaf, or the scholars of the era who speak and to talk about issues, you will fall into misguidance. You will fall into misguidance. This is something that you see in every person of deviation. Everything that he's saying is based upon a violation of this principle. You'll see it with the Ash'aris, Maturidis, Deobandis, in the way that they quote from the past scholars. This is what they're doing. They are using the ambiguous, vague statements of the past scholars, like Imam Ahmad, for example, when they try to use some of his kalam in the issues of Aqidah, and they leave his very clear, explicit, statements in the issues of dispute. So this is the first thing that we pick up. As we said, it is not restricted just to Al-Qadar. It is a general principle across the board. Second reason that the Shaykh mentions is why people fall into misguidance in this topic is that the servants of Allah do not really know the wisdom of Allah Azza wa Jal in every single thing. As in, they do not grasp and understand the wisdom of Allah in everything that He has decreed, in everything that He creates of good and evil, or even in the creation in a general sense. So, as we said already, that a person might have an awareness of some of the wisdoms behind some of the decrees of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his own life, in what happens around him in his family. And likewise in the worldly things, obviously we see there are certain wisdoms in certain things. We see the wisdom in many of the phenomena that Allah has mentioned in the Quran, the wisdom of the sun. What are some of the wisdoms behind the sun? We can know them by observation, analysis, research. The wisdom in the moon. Sometimes we are told some of them in the Quran and the Sunnah, for the reckoning of time. The winds, what they are sent for. The stars, what they are there for. Right? Some of the wisdoms we are told. And so likewise to every other thing in the worldly sense, in Allah's creation, there are wisdoms that we can know by way of research, investigation. But for the large part, the wisdoms of Allah in a general sense, it is not possible for the servants to grasp them all, to know them all, to understand them all, and especially when it comes to the decrees of Allah Azza wa Jal, the things that take place, the actions that take place, the events that take place, The things which are decreed upon people. Why is this one guided? Why is that one misguided? Why is this one sad? Why is that one happy? Why is this one wretched? Why is this one pleased? Right? All of this we cannot perceive, we cannot know and understand that wisdom. Now, when this is the case, there are some people who try to understand what they think to be the wisdom of Allah. They try to speak and delve into the affairs which are taking place in their own souls, in their lives, in their families, in the situations around them, or in the world. They're trying to delve and speak about these issues, and with their opinion. And this is, a reason of their misguidance, because it is known that the wisdoms of Allah Azza wa Jal, there are those wisdoms which are clearly indicated in the Quran and the Sunnah, and there are those which are not known at all, and in fact which are impossible to know. And so for this reason, when a person is ignorant of what is the wisdom of Allah in this, then he has to make taslim, he merely submits, and he's not to make any i'tirad, any objection, observation, criticism, and so on and so forth, because this really is the foundation of misguidance in this topic. A person tries to explain the wisdom of Allah when he doesn't know what the wisdom of Allah is. Right? He starts speculating, starts giving his opinion, starts thinking of things from his own mind, and then he delves into them. And this really is the foundation of all of the misguidance. As Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he's got a book called At-Ta'iyyah. It's a poem. It's called At-Ta'iyyah because it finishes with the letter Ta at the end of every verse. And so here he's got the statement where he says, وَأَصْلُ ضَلَالِ الْخَلْقِ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ هُوَ الْخَوْضُ فِي فِعْلِ الْإِلَهِ بِعِلَّةٍ فإنهم لم يفهموا حكمة له فصاروا على نوع من الجاهلية. Which means the foundation of the misguidance of the whole of creation from every sect is when they start to disputing in the actions of Allah and trying to find reasons for them. Right? For indeed they did not understand the wisdom for his actions, and so therefore they became ignorant upon a type of jahiliyyah. So meaning that the foundation of misguidance is when a person starts saying, oh, Allah did this because of this. Right? They are ignorant of what the reason is. They don't know. And then they start disputing, thinking, oh, well, Allah did this because of this, and Allah did that because of this. This was the wisdom, and that's the wisdom, and that's the wisdom. And he's doing this based upon his opinion, not upon what is in the Quran and the Sunnah. So the wisdom of Allah Azza wa Jal in His Qadar, in His decrees, in what He does, this is largely or mostly unknown to the creation. And an example is given here of an illustration of this is when we reflect upon the story in Surah Al-Kahf, 18th surah, with the story of Musa and Khidr. Musa alayhi salam and Khidr. And Khidr was doing certain things that he had been commanded by Allah Azza wa Jal, and he was doing those things because there was a wisdom behind those actions which he did. He destroyed a ship, he killed a child, he rebuilt the wall, certain things that were done, and Musa alayhi salam did not understand, or he wasn't given knowledge of the end wisdoms behind those deeds, and he was not able to show patience upon the he was not able to show patience, so therefore that knowledge did not come to him in that respect. And so that's why Khidr said at the end of the story, he said, قال هذا فراق بيني وبينك سأنبئك بتأويل ما لم تستطع عليه صبرا. He says, this is the departing point between me and you. I shall inform you of the explanation of that for which you are not able to show patience. And so the point being here in connection to our point is that Sometimes we as servants do not know the wisdom of Allah in most of what He does, what He decrees, and it is not permissible for us to dispute and delve into that with our opinion. Rather, we should submit and have patience and have sabr and leave the affairs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The moment we start delving into these affairs without knowledge, this is the foundation of misguidance. The third reason, so that's the second reason. The first reason, as we said, is abandoning the muhkam and following the mutashabih. The second is trying to find the wisdoms of Allah in His creation by way of one's opinions. The third reason, and in fact this is a large part of the misguidance. You see a lot of the kuffar, the atheists, the non-Muslims, right? They try to find what they obviously, first of all, they don't know the wisdoms of Allah in His khalq, in His creation, in His sharia, in the injunctions in the sharia that we see, whether they're related to marriage, whether related to the punishments, whether related to trade, whatever else, they don't see the wisdoms.
This is the third.
Say again?
This is the third one.
No, I'm just talking about the second one still. So they don't see the wisdoms, and a large part of their objections come because they are juhal. They don't understand Allah's creation, or they think they do, but because they are operating upon an asl where they believe that matter comes from nothing and self-regulates and whatever else, they don't see wisdoms. Or they do, in fact, they do see wisdoms, but they are kadhabun, they are liars. They say everything is an illusion. Right? So they see clear design, wisdom, purpose in everything. In everything they see it. But they say, well, this is just really an illusion. It's not really like that. Because we can explain how it came about. It came about through, evolution, chance, whatever else. So really they see wisdoms. There are clear wisdoms in what they see in the creation, from those wisdoms that humans are able to recognize, but they deny those wisdoms. And then upon that they start making i'tirad, they start making objections against the affairs of tawheed, the affairs of belief, the affairs of the sharia, the affairs of whatever the Muslims are upon. So obviously that's not quite the same thing as what we're discussing here, but it's kind of related in a way that they pretend to be ignorant of the wisdoms of Allah which are apparent in any case, and then there are those wisdoms which a person can't understand, especially when it comes to many of the rulings of the Sharia, many of the judgments and things like that. And so they raise objections against those things, but that's because they have not been given fiqh, have not been given understanding, have not been given tawfiq, and so they wander in their blindness. Now this comes to the third. The third one is making an analogy, making qiyas for the actions of Allah Azza wa Jal with the actions of the servants, as it relates to what is justice and what is oppression. Right? So for example, this means that they look at the actions of Allah Azza wa Jal, which means here His decrees, and then what they see to be justice, because they've only known justice in terms of what is justice amongst the men, amongst the actions of the people, and what is injustice, what is adl, and what is dhulm. So they look in the creation, they see, well, yeah, this thing that this person does, this is from adl, and this thing what people do, this is from dhulm, right? So they have an understanding of things being from adl, from justice, and things being from dhulm as it relates to the actions of men, right? Then they analogize for the actions of Allah Azza wa Jal on the basis of what they see in the creation, right? So then they start saying, well, if Allah did this, this would be dhulm, and if Allah did this, this would be adl, right? But what it is they are making to be adl, justice, and dhulm, injustice, is based purely on what they've seen amongst the actions of men. Right? So basically now they are making analogies for Allah. They are making likenesses for Allah which are incorrect. This would be similar, like this would be similar, for example, if someone says, well, Allah has attributes and I see attributes amongst mankind, and mankind's attributes are a certain way. They hear like this, they see like this, they speak like this, they become pleased like this, they become angry like this, and then they make an analogy. They say, well, the same must be the case for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But we can't, this analogy is false. This analogy cannot be made. Right? Just like we can't make an analogy for his essence and his attributes, likewise we cannot make an analogy for his actions, for his af'al, from which are his decrees. Right? We cannot make analogies like this. And so therefore, they, as we said, made an analogy for Allah Azza wa Jal, and they began to say, they began to speak about Allah's actions, that Allah's actions must be like this, or must be like that, and must be like this, and must be like that, and speaking as if they are to decide what Allah's actions ought to be. Why? Because they are using an understanding of what is justice and injustice, and then saying Allah's actions must be in accordance with those ideas of justice and injustice. And this particular one is actually the foundation of the misguidance of the Qadariyah. The Qadariyah who denied Al-Qadar, We should expand upon this, in due course, inshallah ta'ala. Right? So this is the third reason, making analogies for Allah Azza wa Jal. Evaluating Allah's actions with the understanding of justice and injustice as observed amongst mankind. How can you make this analogy? This analogy is false. You cannot make this analogy. But that's the third reason. That's the third reason why people go astray in this topic. And the fourth reason, we'll come to the fourth reason now. The fourth reason for misguidance in this topic, and again this is a general one as well, not just in the topic of Al-Qadar, but generally speaking, it is to invent new words, new terminologies, new phrases. Alfaz, mustalahat. Right? These phrases, these terms, they're the ones which are now made the foundation. Right? So if we move to another topic, for example, let's to illustrate this with another topic, because it's easy to understand in that topic, and then we'll come back to this topic. For example, in the topic of Allah's names and attributes, right? The Jahmiyyah, when they came about in the 2nd century, they began to use philosophical terms like, for example, jism. Jism means body. Jism means body. Jawhar means a substance. Arad means an attribute which is not permanent. Right? Makan, place. Hayyiz, occupying a space. Jiha, direction. Right? All of these are philosophical terms. These are philosophical terms that came from the Greeks when they start speaking about, the creation and things and matter and attributes, and all of these are philosophical terms. So, these are unknown to the Sahaba. So they brought these terms, and then they began to interpret the texts in light of these innovated terms. These terms had meanings behind them, and then they tried to impose these meanings into some of the verses. Right? So this is an example where you bring foreign, alien terminology, and then you start putting meanings behind those phrases which are incorrect. Then you start speaking of the whole topic on the basis of those words. Right? So instead of, for example, saying that we affirm for Allah what He affirms for Himself of names and attributes and actions, and Allah is As-Sami', Al-Basir, Al-Alim, Al-Hakim, right? He becomes pleased, becomes angry, He has knowledge, He has wisdom, He has mercy, He has a face that befits His majesty, He has, an essence that befits His majesty, and so on and so forth. This is the language that we know. This is the language of the Quran, language of the Sunnah, language conveyed by the Sahaba. But then you have another group coming along saying, well, and you see their books are filled with this type of language and rhetoric. Allah is not a jism. Allah is opposed to all, Allah does not have any hawadith, events. Allah is not in a place. Allah is not in a location. Allah is not in a direction. Allah does not occupy space. Allah is not a body. Where does this language come from? Where does all these terms come from? Innovated. So in a similar way, in numerous fields, you see the same thing taking place. Right? So in this field of Al-Qadar, you see that there's certain words have come about. Al-istita'a, al-taqa, al-kasb, al-takalif. Right? It's not important that we memorize these words and know these words. It's important to understand the principle that the way that misguidance comes about in a topic is that these foreign words are brought about, or they could actually be genuine words. Like, for example, one of these words, kasab. Kasab is mentioned in the Quran. Laha ma kasabat wa aliha ma kasabat. There are words have come in the Quran, but they impose meanings which are false upon these words. Right? So sometimes these words can have a basis in the Quran and the Sunnah, but they use these words with ambiguous, alien, foreign meanings. So these are some of the words: al-istita'a, al-taqa, which means ability and power and capacity, and takalif meaning the obligations, al-kasab, for example. So because we are dealing with an issue of the unseen, Al-Qadar, then it is not permissible to use foreign alien words or other words, new words that have not been used in the Quran and the Sunnah. Why? Because how can you define and explain something which is unknown, which cannot be known and grasped through words that you've brought from yourself? It's not possible. You have to stick to the words of the Quran and the Sunnah. So a person has to bring with the correct words, with the correct meanings. And so as an example, the word kasab, as we said, this is an example in the Quran we see. This is an example in which there is evidence for this word. Laha ma kasabat, at the end of Surah Al-Baqarah. Jaza'an bima kanu yaksibun. As a recompense for that which they used to earn. So this word, al-kasab, yaksib, al-kasb, it is in the Quran. And what they did is that they brought some innovated meanings for this term. So the Qadariya brought their meaning for this term, the Jabariya brought their meaning for this term, and Ahlul Sunnah have their correct understanding of this term. But the point being that words may have a foundation, not have a foundation. If they have a foundation, they may be imposed, they may be impregnated with a meaning which is false. Right? They can insert a meaning into it which is false. And there is a meaning which is correct. So we have to be alert and aware of these kind of issues in the issues of Aqidah in general, but in the issue of Qadar, which we are discussing in particular here. So that's why a lot of the discussions that you see taking place, a lot of the clarifications that you see taking place will be centered around these words, around these terms. But what is the meaning of al-istita'a? What is the meaning of at-taqa? What is the meaning of al-kasab? Right? A lot of the clarifications will be centered around the correct meanings for these words. So basically, the Quran and the Sunnah is a hujjah, is an evidence against everyone who brings terminology that he's brought from his own reason. Right? We follow the Quran and the Sunnah, we follow the naqal, we follow the evidence, and we do not resort to reason, rationale when it comes to using the terms that we use to speak about these issues. So that's the fourth reason: inventing new statement, new phrases, new terminology, or using terms which have a basis but imposing false meanings upon them. Now the fifth reason why people go astray in the topic of Al-Qadar, which cause difference, is, and in fact this one is unique to the topic of Al-Qadar, this specific one here, is they say that, this needs some elaboration, it needs some explanation. Basically, is what they are saying, that Allah Azza wa Jal has to be equal to all of the servants. Right? So basically, now this is connected to the other thing where they're saying they're trying to judge what is justice and injustice that they see amongst men, and then trying to apply it to Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? So what they're saying here in this is they're saying that to be equal to all of the servants is something that Allah is obligated to do. Right? That the servants are equal, should be equal in every single request. Right? That whatever Allah does with respect to His creatures, His creation, right? Allah, all the creation are equal. Let's put this in a slightly different way. What they are saying is they're trying to make something an obligation upon Allah in His actions. Right? That, for example, if you are going to behave with this servant in this way, you have to behave with all of the servants in that way as well. You get it, yeah? For example, Allah might decree some wealth upon this person. Allah might give some opportunities to this person. Right? Now Allah has to be equal to all of the servants. Right? So this is how they are judging. That all of the servants are equal as it relates to Allah. They deserve equal behavior. Right? So it is as if they are imposing upon Allah what should be wajib upon Him. And this they have no right to do. Who are you to be imposing this upon Allah and stating that this is how Allah should behave with His servants? So who are you to be imposing this? Right? But this is one of their principles, and they made the judgment upon the actions of Allah that this would be just for Allah, this would be unjust for Allah, and so therefore this is what is wajib upon Allah to do. Right? This is what they are basically saying. This is what this principle is saying. That they are basically deciding or saying that this is what is wajib upon Allah Azza wa Jal. And so they are saying that it's wajib upon Allah to treat all the people equal in terms of what He gives them, in how He behaves with them. And so if He's going to give this one success in guidance, He should give that one success in guidance. Why is that one now being abandoned? Why is this separation between the servants? This is injustice. Right? So this is the general way of thinking. Right? They are imposing upon Allah what they think to be justice. And part and parcel of this is that they want Allah to treat every single servant to be the same. But this is not this. Allah Azza wa Jal does whatever He pleases. If Allah wants to guide this one, He will guide this one. If Allah wants to misguide this one, He will misguide this one. No one can ask as to what He does. And Allah knows the wisdom. Allah has a wisdom. Allah says there's a wisdom behind this, what Allah does. When He guides, misguides, gives life, takes life, harms, benefits, whatever else. This is with knowledge of this is with Allah. But you can't come along and say now, well, if this one receives this, then everyone should receive that. And if this one is given these opportunities, everyone should receive the same. You have no right to start making these judgments and start saying what is wajib, what is not wajib. You have no right to do that. And so, but again, you see from this principle, if you really grasp this principle, you will see where the misguidance is emanating from. When you put all of these 4 and 5 things together, you see the misguidance, why and how it emanates from these people. And so this is why they were led to say that Allah does not create the actions of the servants. Right? Allah has to be just to everybody. Allah has to be equal to everybody. So it can't be Allah who is decreeing these. It can't be Allah who is creating these actions. Because this would be unjust for Allah. Because what is wajib upon Allah is that if such person is guided, that one should be guided as well. If this one is given wealth, that one should be given wealth as well. Right? They want everything to be equal. But because everything is not equal, because this one is guided, that one is misguided, this one is in poverty, this one is in riches, this one is healthy, that one is sick, that one has a short life, that one has a long life. Right? All of this variation. You see, well, obviously, Allah can't be doing this. Because what is wajib upon Allah is to be equal to everybody. Right? So clearly the servants are acting upon their own accord. The servants are creating their own actions. Right? So this principle here, this point that they are making, that Allah has, they're making it wajib upon Allah to be like this or to be like that or to be like this. This is a principle they've invented. Right? They're saying that Allah has to be just to everybody, give everybody equal opportunity for guidance and misguidance. But this is a question that can't be raised because Allah does whatever He wishes. Allah, in His wisdom, He knows things that we do not know. He knows which one deserves misguidance. He knows which one deserves misguidance. He knows which one deserves wealth, which one wealth should be kept away from, for wisdoms that Allah knows. Who are you to presume this and start making wajib upon Allah, this and that, whatever? This is utter misguidance. So, from this, or from all of this, what we should take from this is that basically, what is wajib upon us in the affairs of the unseen, because the issue of Al-Qadar, which is the secret of Allah, only Allah knows, it is from the unseen. We have to stick to the Quran and the Sunnah, and we have to make taslim. We submit. This is how it is, and we accept this is how it is. Don't start using our aql, our opinions, to start contradicting, to start trying understanding what we cannot understand, to start gaining knowledge of what has been kept away from us and what is impossible for us to know. All of this it will lead to misguidance. And for that reason, this is why we say, of the people of knowledge, they say, آمنا به كل من عند ربنا. آمنا به كل من عند ربنا. We believe in all of it. All of it is from our Lord. This is what those who are deeply grounded in knowledge, this is what they say. Alongside the fact that we know that the people of knowledge do understand the explanation of certain things, but those things they do not know, they simply submit and they say, we believe in all of it is from our Lord. Now obviously when you start taking texts and you start throwing those texts against each other, this is the foundation of misguidance, and this is what was done by the Qadariyah, by the Jabariyah, and they're trying to unveil the secret of Allah. As it is said, Al-Qadar, the saying of Ali radiallahu anhu, Al-Qadar sirrullah. Al-Qadar is the secret of Allah. فَلَا تَكْشِفْهُ. So do not try to unveil it. Don't try to unveil it. Because anyone who tries to unveil the secret of Allah, there is no doubt he will go to misguidance. Because this is something unique and specific only to Allah Azza wa Jal. So I think we'll conclude our lesson there today. This really was an introduction. We haven't got to the actual issues, but this is a useful introduction to understand how and why people are misguided in the topic of Al-Qadar specifically in certain respects, but more generally even in the other areas as well. So some of these issues are generally applicable in the other fields of knowledge, in Al-Asma wa Sifat, in Al-Iman, and other topics to do with the Sahaba, and so on and so forth. So that there are useful things to know. So we'll conclude our lesson there today, inshallah ta'ala. In the next lesson we'll continue looking at some of the specific issues to do with Al-Qadar, on the basis of which people went astray. We'll look at that inshallah ta'ala in some detail. We'll conclude there. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.